I wish my father-in-law was my dad. He actually understands me. Those words shattered 30 years of sacrifice in one Christmas dinner. There I sat, still in my trucking uniform after driving 15 hours to make it home for the holidays, watching my only daughter praise the man who married into comfort while dismissing the father who built her entire world from nothing. Every parent knows that moment when your child sees you as inadequate compared to someone who never bled for them. She said it right after opening my $5,000 gift like it was pocket change, gushing over her father-in-law's cheap wine and empty compliments. I'd raised her alone after her mother died, spent decades on highways building her future, and she wished another man was her father. That night, I decided it was time she learned what real understanding looks like, the hard way. My name is Walt Mackenzie, and this is how one Christmas dinner taught my daughter the difference between a provider and a performer. Before I tell you how one Christmas dinner changed our relationship forever, hit that subscribe button and share this with any parent who's ever felt unappreciated, because what happened next taught us both what family gratitude truly means. Christmas morning silence hits differently when your own child breaks your heart. I sat in my truck outside Sarah's house until 3 a.m., engine running, heater on, staring at the perfect white picket fence I'd helped pay for but was never invited to help build. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a man who'd driven through every kind of weather America could throw at a trucker, and I couldn't find the courage to drive away from my daughter's driveway. The radio played Silent Night, while I replayed her words over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. I wish my father-in-law was my dad. He actually understands me. 38 years old, my little girl, and she still had the power to reduce me to nothing with a single sentence. I remembered holding her as a newborn, promising her dying mother I'd be enough for both parents, whispering to that tiny bundle that Daddy would never let her down. Well, apparently I'd failed that promise spectacularly. The worst part wasn't the disrespect, it was the casual way she'd said it, like my feelings didn't even register as something worth considering. I'd driven 15 hours straight, missing Christmas Eve dinner at the truck stop with my driver buddies, pushing through a snowstorm that had half the interstate shut down, all to make sure I was there when she opened that bracelet. $5,000, more than some people make in 2 months, and she'd barely glanced at it before moving on to gush over Richard's $20 wine bottle and his stories about appreciating the finer things in life.
Richard.
Her father-in-law, a man who'd inherited his daddy's insurance business, never worked a day of real labor in his life, and somehow represented everything she thought a father should be. Sophisticated, well-spoken,
Clean hands.
the kind of man who talked about wine pairings and European vacations while I talked about DOT regulations and delivery schedules. I pulled out my phone and looked at the last text she'd sent me before Christmas. Dad, can you pick up some ice on your way?
Thanks. Naughty love you.
Not, I'm excited to see you. Just a request for ice, like I was the hired help. Maybe that's all I'd ever been to her. The man who showed up when something needed to be done disappeared when the real family time began. The house was dark now except for the Christmas tree lights in the front window, and I wondered if she was lying in bed thinking about what she'd said, feeling even a flicker of regret. Probably not. She was probably cuddled up with her husband, maybe even laughing about poor old Dad and his hurt feelings. The dashboard clock read 3:47 a.m. when I finally put the truck in drive. As I pulled away from that perfect suburban street, I made myself a promise that would change everything between us. My daughter was about to learn the difference between taking someone for granted and truly understanding them. She wanted to compare me to Richard?
Fine.
Let's see how well she understood either one of us when the safety net I'd been providing disappeared. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and Christmas morning was about to become a whole lot quieter in the Mackenzie family.
I drove a million miles so she didn't ever have to walk a hard road.
That's not poetry, that's mathematics. 30 years of logbooks, fuel receipts, and sleepless nights add up to exactly 1,247,000 miles on American highways, every single one driven with Sarah's future riding shotgun in my mind. It started when she was 3 years old and Mary lost her battle with cancer, leaving me with a mortgage, a toddler, and a choice that would define both our lives. find a desk job that paid peanuts but kept me home, or take my CDL on the road where the real money lived. I chose the road, and for the next 15 years I became a ghost in my own daughter's life, present in every way that mattered, absent in every way that showed. While other fathers coached Little League, I was hauling refrigerated loads through Texas heat waves. While they attended school plays, I was chaining up tires in Rocky Mountain snowstorms. But every Thursday night, no matter where I was in the continental United States, my truck found its way to a phone booth so I could hear about Sarah's spelling test, her first crush, her high school graduation speech she was practicing. Those phone calls cost more than most people spent on groceries, but hearing, "Daddy, guess what happened today," was worth every overpriced highway minute. The real sacrifice wasn't the missed moments. It was the constant choice between being her provider and being her presence. I remember the Christmas she turned 8, when I'd been on a 3-week haul to deliver construction equipment to Alaska. The company offered double rates for drivers willing to miss the holidays, and Sarah's private school tuition wasn't going to pay itself. I called her from a truck stop in Anchorage while she opened presents, pretending I wasn't crying as she described the bike Santa brought. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" she asked, and I lied through my teeth. "Soon, baby girl. Daddy's just finishing up important work." Important work. That's what I called missing my daughter's childhood. Important work. But it was important, even if she'd never understand it. Every mile I drove was a mile away from poverty, from the kind of struggle that had defined my own childhood in rural Kentucky. My father had been a coal miner who came home black with dust and empty of dreams. I swore Sarah would never know that kind of limitation, never have to choose between her desires and her budget, never have to apologize for wanting something better. By the time she turned 16, I owned 3 trucks and was contracting with drivers across the Midwest. By 21, when she graduated college debt-free, I had 17 trucks and a distribution center in Cedar Falls. By 30, when she married Richard, McKenzie Logistics was the largest independent shipping company between Chicago and Denver, and she had no idea her simple trucker dad was the man signing paychecks for half the delivery drivers in Iowa. The cruelest irony was watching her fall in love with Richard's inherited sophistication while dismissing everything I'd built from scratch. She admired his wine knowledge while forgetting I'd paid for every bottle in her college wine tasting club. She praised his cultural awareness while overlooking the fact that I'd worked extra shifts to send her on those European study abroad trips that opened her mind. She respected his business acumen while never asking what kind of business kept her childhood so comfortable, her college so affordable, her wedding so lavish. I'd hidden my success because I wanted her love to be authentic, not transactional. I wanted her to be proud of her father for who he was, not what he owned. But in protecting her from knowing about the money, I'd accidentally taught her to be ashamed of the work that earned it. Every time she introduced me as just a truck driver, she was erasing 30 years of 18-hour days, missed birthdays, and solo Christmas dinners at highway diners. She was reducing an empire built on sacrifice to a stereotype that embarrassed her in front of her educated friends. That Christmas night, driving away from her house, I realized my greatest failure as a father wasn't missing her school plays or bedtime stories. It was raising a daughter who confused struggle with failure, who saw calloused hands as a mark of inadequacy instead of a badge of dedication. Tomorrow, that was going to change. I gave her everything I never had, but forgot to teach her where it came from. Sarah Mackenzie Hartwell, she'd hyphenated her name, of course, because Mackenzie alone sounds too blue-collar, had become everything I'd dreamed of and nothing I'd hoped for. At 38, she was a pediatric nurse with a master's degree from Northwestern, living in a colonial house with granite countertops and a 3-car garage, married to a man who'd never questioned where money came from because it had always just appeared. She drove a BMW X5 that she'd mentioned needing for safety, and somehow my credit card had handled the down payment. She wore designer clothes to her book club meetings where they discussed literature I'd never heard of and sipped wines that cost more than I used to make in a day. And yet somehow, in giving her access to everything refined and beautiful, I'd accidentally created someone who found me embarrassing. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. I remember her at 7 years old, sitting in my truck cab during a delivery stop, fascinated by the CB radio chatter and begging to pull the air horn. She'd called herself Daddy's Little Road Warrior and collected truck stop postcards from every state I visited. But by high school, when her friends' parents started showing up to events in suits instead of flannel shirts, something shifted. She stopped mentioning my profession in introductions, started saying I was in transportation logistics instead of drives a truck. The first time I heard her use that phrase, I was proud. She was protecting my dignity. I didn't realize she was protecting herself from association with me.
College amplified everything.
The private liberal arts education I'd sacrificed to provide opened her mind to art, philosophy, and social justice, but somehow closed her heart to the value of honest labor. She came home sophomore year explaining how blue-collar work was systematically devalued by capitalist structures, using $50 words to describe why my life's work was inherently less meaningful than her future career, helping people. The irony was suffocating. I was helping people too, keeping America's supply chains moving, ensuring medications reached hospitals, food reached stores, Christmas presents reached families. But because I did it in steel-toed boots instead of scrubs, it didn't count as noble work in her newly educated worldview. Her wedding to Richard was the beginning of the end of who she used to be. Richard Hartwell III, yes, the third, brought her into a social circle where everyone had inherited something: money, businesses, respect, opportunities. They had charity galas and wine tastings and conversations about summering in the Hamptons. Sarah blossomed in this environment, finally finding people who appreciated her intelligence and sophistication. What she didn't realize was that her sophistication was purchased with highway miles and diesel fuel, funded by a man who'd never stepped foot in the country clubs that now welcomed her. The cruel irony deepened when she became a pediatric nurse. She'd chosen a helping profession, dedicated her life to caring for children, and I was incredibly proud of her compassion. But somehow she'd compartmentalized her empathy: endless patience for sick kids and their worried parents, zero understanding for the father who'd made her career possible. She could spot signs of neglect in a child from across a hospital room, but couldn't see the sacrifice in her own father's calloused hands. This Christmas had been the culmination of years of small slights and growing distance. The way she'd introduced me to Richard's parents as my father who drives trucks for a living, not proudly, not gratefully, just factually, like announcing someone's medical condition. The way she'd physically moved between us when I tried to join a conversation about vacation planning, as if my input about travel wasn't relevant because I traveled for work instead of pleasure. The way she'd corrected my grammar in front of her in-laws, not maliciously, but with the automatic condescension of someone who'd forgotten that intelligence comes in more forms than academic credentials. She'd become someone who valued appearance over substance, breeding over character, credentials over capability. In trying to give her every advantage I'd never had, I'd accidentally raised someone who saw my limitations as failures instead of my efforts as love. Tomorrow, she was going to discover that the man she was embarrassed to call father was the same man who'd been quietly ensuring she never had to be embarrassed about anything else. The lesson was going to hurt us both, but some bridges can only be rebuilt after they've been completely torn down. Some men charm with words, others bleed in silence. She couldn't see the difference. Richard Hartwell, too, was a masterpiece of inherited confidence, the kind of man who'd never questioned his place in the world because that place had been reserved for him since birth. At 65, he possessed the effortless sophistication that only comes from never having to earn it. Silver hair perfectly styled, hands soft as a baby's, wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone who'd grown up being listened to, dropping references to European wines and classical music like breadcrumbs, leading to his obvious superiority. His insurance agency, Hartwell and Associates, had been founded by his grandfather in 1952 and handed down like a family heirloom, requiring nothing more from Richard than showing up and not burning the building down. The man had never spent a night wondering if he could make payroll, never missed a meal to save money, never drove through a blizzard because someone was counting on him. And somehow, this made him the perfect father figure in Sarah's eyes. The night I met him, at Sarah and Richard III engagement party, he'd cornered me by the bar with what he probably thought was friendly conversation. "So, Walt, trucking must be challenging. All that time away from family." The pause before challenging was carefully calculated, the tone suggesting he was being diplomatic about my obviously limited career choice. Then came his favorite move, the subtle redirect to showcase his own worldliness. "I just returned from a wine-buying trip to Tuscany." "Have you ever been to Italy, Walt?" He knew damn well I hadn't been to Italy. Men like Richard II have a radar for detecting experiences they can lord over others. What he didn't know was that while he was touring vineyards and discussing terroir with sommeliers, I was building a logistics empire that could buy and sell his little insurance office 10 times over. But I'd smiled and said no, I hadn't made it to Italy yet, and watched him launch into a 15-minute soliloquy about the importance of exposing oneself to different cultures. The cruel irony was that Richard understood Sarah in exactly the way that required zero sacrifice. He appreciated her intelligence because it reflected well on his family's choice in marriage partners. He supported her career because pediatric nursing was socially acceptable and vaguely noble. He encouraged her interests in art and literature because these were the proper pursuits of a well-bred woman. His understanding was comfortable, predictable, and completely surface level. I understood Sarah differently. I understood that her compassion for sick children came from growing up with a father who'd had to be both mother and father, teaching her that love means showing up even when it's hard. I understood that her drive for perfection stemmed from watching me work 18-hour days to give her opportunities. I understood that her appreciation for beautiful things was possible only because someone else had chosen ugly, grinding work to pay for them. But my understanding was silent, invisible, buried under years of missed recitals and homework sessions completed over phone calls from truck stops. Richard's understanding was all performance and presentation, wine recommendations, book suggestions, thoughtful gifts that demonstrated his cultural sophistication. My understanding was all substance and sacrifice, college tuition, down payments, safety nets that were so reliable they became invisible. She preferred his performance because it made her feel sophisticated, validated, understood in ways that mattered to her educated social circle. My substance felt heavy, obligatory, tinged with guilt about privileges she'd never had to earn. The most painful part was watching her light up when Richard made his observations about her character, her potential, her wonderful qualities. "Sarah has such refined taste," he'd say, and she'd beam like he'd discovered something profound about her soul. What he'd actually discovered was something I'd spent 30 years cultivating and paying for. Her refined taste was my proudly successful daughter exercising options I'd worked myself half to death to provide. But Richard got the credit for noticing, while I got the bill for creating. Tonight, all of that was going to change. Let's see how much Richard understood about Sarah when the foundation I'd built started shifting beneath their perfect little world. Every rolled eye at my work clothes was a knife in the heart of my sacrifice. The disrespect didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It accumulated like rust, small betrayals that ate away at our relationship one disappointment at a time. I can pinpoint exactly when it started. Sarah's high school graduation, when I showed up straight from a delivery run in my company uniform, diesel smell still clinging to my shirt, and watched her face fall as her friends' parents approached in their business attire. She didn't say anything that day, but she didn't have to. The way she positioned herself between me and her honor society friends, the way she hurried through introductions without mentioning what I did for work, the way she suggested I might want to freshen up before the restaurant, it all spoke louder than words. By college, the shame had crystallized into a systematic campaign of erasure. Parent weekend freshman year, she'd asked me to meet her at a coffee shop off campus instead of coming to the dorm. "It's just easier," she'd said, which I translated correctly as less embarrassing. When I asked why, she'd given me that patient smile reserved for people who don't understand social dynamics. "Dad, you wouldn't be comfortable. These people are different." Different. That word followed us everywhere after that. I was different at her medical school graduation, where she'd coached me on what to say if anyone asked about my profession.
Just say you're in logistics, Dad.
You don't have to explain about the trucks. The coaching felt like rehearsing lines for a play where I was the comic relief everyone tolerated but nobody really wanted around. The engagement party had been a masterclass in strategic placement. Sarah had seated me at the family table, safely surrounded by elderly relatives who wouldn't ask probing questions about career advancement or retirement portfolios. Meanwhile, Richard's father held court at the main table, regaling guests with stories about his recent golf trip to Scotland and his thoughts on market trends. I'd watched my daughter hang on his every word while carefully avoiding eye contact with me across the room. But the small moments hurt more than the public ones. The way she'd answer her phone differently when I called during her hospital shifts, professional voice, clipped responses, always aware that colleagues might overhear her talking to Dad the trucker. The way she'd edit my gifs out of social media posts, sharing photos of flowers from Richard III while never mentioning the jewelry, the appliances, the vacation money that appeared whenever she mentioned needing something. The way she'd changed the subject whenever her nurse friends asked about family, redirecting to discussions about Richard's family business or their weekend plans at the country club. The worst betrayal was watching her develop amnesia about her own childhood. When Richard III's sister had complimented Sarah's independence and work ethic, Sarah had credited her mother's early death with teaching her to be self-reliant. No mention of the father who'd worked double shifts to afford the private school that developed her independence, or the man who'd raised her alone while teaching her that hard work was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. She'd rewritten our history, casting herself as a self-made woman who'd overcome adversity through education and determination, conveniently forgetting that her determination was funded by someone else's sweat equity. The evolution accelerated after her marriage. Suddenly, every family gathering became an exercise in damage control. She'd brief Richard III beforehand about my quirks, my habit of checking my phone for dispatch calls, my tendency to tip service workers generously, my unfamiliarity with wine etiquette. I became a problem to be managed rather than a father to be celebrated. The final straw before Christmas had been Thanksgiving, when she'd actually asked me to park my truck around the corner because the neighbors might think we're having work done on the house. 30 years of sacrifice, and I'd become the kind of embarrassment that required strategic parking. Each small humiliation was justified in her mind as protecting my feelings or avoiding awkward situations, but what she was really protecting was her carefully constructed image as someone who belonged in Richard's world. She'd convinced herself that love meant shielding me from situations where I might feel uncomfortable, never realizing that the most uncomfortable situation of all was being treated like a liability by my own daughter. That Christmas dinner comment about wishing Richard II was her father wasn't an isolated insult. It was the culmination of years of small betrayals, the final confirmation that she'd succeeded in erasing the man who'd built her entire world. I built wealth on 18 wheels because love drives harder than ambition. What Sarah saw as Dad's trucking job was actually Mackenzie Logistics, a $47 million empire spanning 6 states with 127 trucks for distribution centers and contracts with everyone from Walmart to Amazon. The company she'd never heard of employed 312 people, owned a fleet worth more than most small-town bank holdings, and generated enough annual revenue to buy Richard's precious insurance agency 12 times over. But she didn't know any of this because I'd made a deliberate choice 30 years ago to love her more than I loved being impressive.
The empire started small, born from desperation rather than ambition.
When Mary died and left me with a 3-year-old and a mountain of medical bills, I had exactly $847 in my checking account and a CDL license I'd earned in community college. I bought my first truck, a beat-up Kenworth with 400,000 miles, for $12,000 borrowed against Mary's life insurance policy. The irony still stings. I used my dead wife's money to start the business that would keep me away from our daughter for the next 15 years. But every mile I drove was a mile away from poverty. Every delivery was another brick in the foundation of Sarah's future. By her 5th birthday, I owned 3 trucks and had hired my first 2 drivers. By her 10th birthday, Mackenzie Logistics had secured its first major retail contract and opened a second depot in Des Moines. By her sweet 16, We were handling pharmaceutical deliveries across the Midwest, the high-value, time-sensitive loads that separate real logistics companies from guys with trucks. Each expansion was calculated around Sarah's milestones. I bought the Indiana Distribution Center the year she started college because I knew she'd need 4 years of tuition, room, board, and study abroad programs. I acquired the competing firm in Wisconsin the year she entered nursing school because graduate degrees cost twice as much as undergraduate ones. I purchased the freight forwarding operation in Minneapolis the year she got engaged because weddings are expensive and I'd be damned if my daughter would start marriage worrying about money. The hardest part wasn't building the business, it was keeping it secret. Every success had to be hidden, every achievement celebrated alone. When McKenzie Logistics won the Midwest Transportation Company of the Year award in 2019, I attended the ceremony by myself, accepting recognition for employing over 200 people while knowing my own daughter would be embarrassed if she saw the trophy on my mantle. When Forbes mentioned us in an article about America's fastest-growing private companies, I cut out the clipping and put it in a folder Sarah would never see. The decision to hide my success wasn't about modesty, it was about authenticity. I wanted Sarah to love me for being her father, not for being her financial solution. I wanted our relationship built on real connection, not transactional gratitude. I wanted her respect to come from understanding my character, not calculating my net worth. But in hiding the magnitude of what I'd built, I'd accidentally taught her to undervalue the builder. She saw the calloused hands and diesel-stained clothes without understanding they belonged to a man who'd revolutionized cold storage logistics in the upper Midwest. She heard the truck driver vocabulary without realizing it came from someone who spoke boardroom language fluently when the situation required it. She observed the blue-collar lifestyle without knowing it was a choice, not a limitation. The most painful irony was that every snide comment about my simple life was funded by the complexity she couldn't see. Her BMW was leased through McKenzie Logistics Fleet Management Program. Her mortgage down payment came from my quarterly profit distributions. Her European honeymoon was paid for with money I'd earned negotiating shipping contracts in 3 languages she didn't know I spoke. She criticized my lack of sophistication while living a sophisticated life I'd made possible. Richard II had noticed, of course. During one of their precious wine-tasting conversations, he'd mentioned seeing McKenzie Logistics trucks everywhere and wondering who owned that impressive operation. Sarah had laughed and said she had no idea, probably some corporate conglomerate. If she'd asked me, I could have told her exactly who owned it, the embarrassing father she wished she could replace. Tonight, that ignorance was going to cost her more than she could imagine. Every single father's fear. Did losing her mother mean losing my way with her? That question haunted me every Christmas since Mary died, but this year it felt like a verdict rather than a worry. Sitting in my empty kitchen at 4 a.m., surrounded by 30 years of Father's Day cards that had grown progressively more formal over the years, I forced myself to confront the possibility that I'd fundamentally failed as a single parent. Maybe Sarah was right to prefer Richard II. Maybe she'd needed a father who understood emotional sophistication instead of one who thought love was measured in overtime hours and college fund contributions. The brutal truth about single fatherhood is that you're constantly improvising with no safety net and no one to tell you when you're screwing up. When Sarah was 7 and came home crying because a classmate said she didn't have a real family, I'd handled it by taking her out for ice cream and explaining that families come in all shapes. Looking back, maybe she'd needed me to validate her pain instead of rushing to fix it. When she was 13 and asked why she couldn't have sleepovers like other girls, I'd explained about my driving schedule and promised to make it up to her. But making it up with expensive gifts probably taught her that money was my primary language of love. The hardest moments were the ones where I'd tried to be both parents and failed at being either. The morning she got her first period, I'd panicked and called my sister Janet from Michigan, putting Sarah on the phone with an aunt she barely knew because I was too embarrassed to handle something Mary should have been there for. Sarah had been mortified, and I'd made it worse by buying her flowers afterward like that could erase the awkwardness. I should have just sat down and had an honest conversation about growing up, but instead I'd outsourced the moment to someone else and tried to apologize with roses. Every milestone became a reminder of what she was missing. When it came time for prom dress shopping, I'd given her my credit card and told her to take her friend's mother, terrified that my presence would somehow diminish the experience. When she graduated nursing school, I cheered louder than anyone else in the auditorium, but afterwards I'd watched other families take multi-generational photos and realized Sarah was taking pictures with just me. No grandmother, no mother, just the father who'd never learned how to braid hair or navigate teenage girl drama. Maybe that's why she'd gravitated toward Richard II. He represented the kind of stable, two-parent family structure she'd never experienced. His easy confidence with social situations, his comfortable discussions about feelings and relationships, his natural ability to make her feel understood and validated. These were skills I'd never developed because I'd been too busy making sure she had everything she needed to even think about what she wanted emotionally. The most devastating possibility was that in trying so hard to be enough for both parents, I'd accidentally taught her that I wasn't enough as either one. I'd overcompensated financially because I was underconfident emotionally. I'd bought her love because I wasn't sure I knew how to earn it through conversation and connection. I'd hidden my business success because I wanted authentic affection, but maybe what I'd actually hidden was my capability to be the sophisticated father she'd apparently always wanted. Mary would have known how to balance providing with nurturing, how to teach Sarah to appreciate sacrifice without making her feel guilty about it, how to raise a daughter who was proud of her father instead of embarrassed by him. Mary would have known how to help Sarah understand that calloused hands and a generous heart weren't mutually exclusive, that working-class roots and worldly success could coexist in the same person. But Mary was gone, and I'd spent 30 years winging it, apparently teaching my daughter all the wrong lessons about what mattered in life. Tonight, for the first time since her funeral, I wished Mary could see what our little girl had become. Not because I was proud, but because I needed someone else to tell me where I'd gone wrong and whether it was too late to fix it. Gratitude can't be bought, but disrespect has a price that must be paid. Christmas Dinner 2024 will forever be etched in my memory as the moment my daughter crossed a line I'd spent 30 years pretending didn't exist. I'd arrived at 6 p.m. sharp, still in my Peterbilt uniform because I'd driven straight through from a priority delivery in Kansas City, determined not to miss another family gathering. The $5,000 Cartier bracelet was wrapped perfectly in my passenger seat. 2 months of careful saving disguised as an impulsive gift from Dad's trucking money. I'd even practiced my casual response for when she inevitably asked about the expense. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. Daddy had a good quarter." The dinner started normally enough. Richard III carved the honey-glazed ham while discussing his architectural firm's latest municipal project. Sarah bustled around the kitchen in her Williams-Sonoma apron, orchestrating the meal with the precision of someone who'd learned to entertain from food magazines rather than family tradition. Richard II held court from the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories about his recent charity board meeting and their successful fundraising for underprivileged youth, the kind of performative generosity that looks good in country club newsletters. I sat quietly at my assigned spot, the furthest from the conversation center, watching my daughter beam at her father-in-law's every observation about wine pairings and proper table setting etiquette. When gift exchange time arrived, I presented Sarah's bracelet with the nervous excitement of a teenager giving his first Valentine. She opened it with polite appreciation, holding it up to catch the light while making appropriately grateful sounds.
"Oh, Dad, this is lovely."
"You really shouldn't have spent so much." The dismissive tone was subtle but unmistakable, the same voice she used when I overpaid restaurant tips or bought name-brand groceries instead of store-brand. Richard II had chosen that moment to present his gift, a $47 bottle of Barolo from his recent Italian adventure, accompanied by a 15-minute lecture about the wine's provenance and proper storage temperature. Sarah listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions about tannin structure and aging potential, treating his expertise like precious wisdom being passed down through generations. "Richard, you have such sophisticated taste," she gushed, cradling the bottle like it contained liquid gold. "You always know exactly what I need to expand my palate." Then came the moment that changed everything. Richard III's sister Andrea, visiting from Portland with her photographer husband, had made an innocent comment about how wonderful it must be to have such supportive fathers in Sarah's life. Instead of acknowledging both men who'd shaped her world, Sarah had launched into an effusive monologue about Richard II's guidance and understanding, his ability to really see who I am as a person, his gift for appreciating the things that matter to me intellectually and culturally. The praise went on for several minutes, each word landing like a physical blow. And then, as if my presence at the table had suddenly become unbearable, she delivered the knockout punch with a laugh that was meant to sound affectionate but felt like acid. Honestly, sometimes I wish my father-in-law was my dad. He actually understands me. The table fell silent. Richard II had the grace to look uncomfortable, Richard III studied his wine glass intensely, and Andrea's husband found something fascinating on his phone screen. But Sarah continued, either oblivious to the crater she just created or determined to make her point completely clear. I mean, Dad tries, but Richard just gets it, you know? The books I read, the wine I like, the way I see the world. We can actually have conversations about ideas. I'd sat there in my diesel-stained uniform, the Cartier bracelet forgotten on her wrist, and felt 30 years of love and sacrifice reduced to inadequacy in front of people I'd helped support but who'd never bothered to know me. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. It was watching her say it with complete sincerity, as if comparing her fathers was as natural as comparing restaurant reviews. She genuinely believed Richard II understood her better because he could discuss Bordeaux classifications while I could only discuss DOT regulations. What she didn't understand was that understanding isn't about shared vocabulary. It's about shared sacrifice, and no one in that room had sacrificed more for her understanding than the embarrassing man in work clothes she just wished she could replace. Sometimes love requires removing the safety net to teach appreciation. That night, driving home through empty Iowa highways with my daughter's words echoing in my cab, I made a decision that would either save our relationship or destroy it completely. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge would have been easy, satisfying, and ultimately meaningless. This was about love in its most difficult form, the kind that demands growth even when growth is painful. I'd spent 30 years being the invisible foundation of Sarah's life, and she'd learned to take foundations for granted because they're always just there, supporting everything else without asking for recognition. Tonight, she was going to discover what happens when the foundation decides to take a vacation. The plan crystallized as I passed the McKenzie Logistics Depot in Cedar Falls, seeing my trucks lined up like sleeping giants in the moonlight. Each one represented a choice I'd made to prioritize Sarah's future over my own comfort, my own relationships, my own dreams of a simpler life. I'd sacrificed everything to ensure she never had to struggle, and in doing so, I'd accidentally taught her that struggle was for other people. People like her embarrassing father who didn't understand her sophisticated world. The hardest part about tough love is that it requires you to temporarily become the villain in someone else's story. I was about to cut off every financial support system I'd quietly maintained for years, and Sarah would experience it as cruelty rather than education. She'd tell her friends about her petty father who'd punished her for an innocent comment, never understanding that the comment itself was the symptom of a much deeper problem I should have addressed years ago. But enabling someone isn't love, it's fear disguised as generosity. I'd been afraid to let Sarah experience natural consequences because I'd confused protecting her from hardship with protecting her from character development. Real love sometimes means allowing the people you care about to struggle long enough to appreciate what they previously took for granted. The financial architecture I was about to dismantle was more complex than Sarah could imagine. Her mortgage payments were automatically covered by a trust I'd established through McKenzie Logistics' legal department. Her car lease, insurance premiums, credit card payments, and even her grocery budget were all subsidized through various discrete channels I'd created to avoid making her feel dependent. She lived like an independently successful professional while actually being supported like the beloved daughter of a multimillionaire. Tomorrow, all of that invisible support would simply stop. No dramatic announcements, no angry confrontations, no detailed explanations about hurt feelings.
Just silence where financial safety used to be.
She'd discover that her sophisticated lifestyle required a lot more income than a pediatric nurse's salary could provide, especially one who'd grown accustomed to premium everything without ever calculating the actual cost. The beauty of the plan was its educational value. Sarah would have to examine every aspect of her comfortable life and figure out which parts she could actually afford versus which parts had been quietly funded by the father she found embarrassing. She'd have to choose between the BMW and the mortgage payment, between the wine collection and the utility bills, between maintaining appearances and maintaining independence. Most importantly, she'd have to confront the uncomfortable reality that her sense of superiority over her simple father was built on his complex financial engineering. I wasn't doing this to hurt her. I was doing this to wake her up. Somewhere along the way, I'd accidentally raised a daughter who confused privilege with personal achievement, who mistook being supported with being self-sufficient, who thought gratitude was optional as long as the bills kept getting paid. The woman who wished Richard II was her father needed to spend some time living without any father's help at all. The plan would work because Sarah was fundamentally decent underneath all the entitlement. She'd inherited her mother's kind heart and her father's work ethic, even if both qualities had been buried under years of unearned comfort. When the safety net disappeared, she'd remember who she really was beneath the designer clothes and sophisticated pretensions. She'd rediscover the values I thought I'd taught her but had apparently purchased instead. By morning, I'd made all the necessary calls to my accountant, my lawyer, and my bank. The support systems that had been running automatically for years would be quietly discontinued. Sarah's life was about to become a lot more honest, and honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is always better than beautiful lies that prevent people from growing into who they're supposed to become. 30 years of silent support was about to become very loud absence. The next morning, I sat in my home office, a room Sarah had never seen because she'd never bothered visiting my house since her mother died, surrounded by file cabinets full of financial instruments she didn't know existed. Each document represented another layer of the invisible safety net I was about to systematically dismantle. The first call went to Marcus Rodriguez, my accountant for the past 15 years. Marcus, I need you to terminate the Cedar Falls Family Trust, effective immediately. Yes, the one that's been covering Sarah's mortgage. No, this isn't a tax strategy. Just close it down. Marcus had handled enough family business over the years to know not to ask too many questions, but I could hear the concern in his voice. The trust had been his proudest creation, a legal structure that allowed me to support Sarah's lifestyle while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of her comfort. Walt, you sure about this? That trust has been running smooth for 8 years. Sarah's gonna notice when her mortgage payments start bouncing. That was exactly the point. The second call went to Rebecca Chen at First National, where I'd maintained Sarah's emergency fund, a $75,000 account that automatically covered any overdrafts on her personal checking account. Rebecca had been puzzled by my request to close the account until I explained that the emergency was over. But Mr. Mackenzie, your daughter uses this service almost monthly. Her spending patterns suggest she's not aware of the safety net. Are you sure you want to eliminate it without warning her? Again, that was exactly the point. The most complex conversation was with David Hartman at Mackenzie Logistics Legal Department. Sarah's car lease was technically held by our corporate fleet management program, which allowed her to drive a BMW for the cost of a Honda Civic. Her health insurance was supplemented through our company group plan. Even her grocery shopping was subsidized through a corporate credit card I'd issued under the pretense of emergency family expenses. David had set up these arrangements to be legally bulletproof but emotionally invisible.
David, I need everything terminated by end of business today.
The car lease reverts to market rates, the insurance supplementation stops, and cancel the corporate card. Make it clean, no paper trail that leads back to me being petty or vindictive. This wasn't about appearing blameless. This was about forcing Sarah to confront reality without giving her an easy target for her anger. The hardest part was calculating exactly how much financial impact Sarah was about to experience. Her actual nursing salary was $68,000 per year, respectable but nowhere near sufficient for the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to maintaining. Between the mortgage assistance, car subsidies, insurance supplements, and discretionary spending support, I'd been contributing roughly $4,200 per month to her standard of living. Without my invisible contributions, her financial reality would shift from comfortable professional to struggling single-income household overnight. The beautiful irony was that Sarah prided herself on being financially independent, frequently posting social media content about strong women who don't need anyone's help, while living on an artificially inflated budget that made independence possible. She'd built her entire adult identity around being self-sufficient, never realizing that her self-sufficiency was carefully funded by the father she found embarrassing. By noon, every support system had been legally terminated. Sarah's next mortgage payment would be entirely her responsibility. Her BMW lease would jump from $347 per month to $847 per month at market rates. Her premium health insurance would be replaced by whatever her hospital offered to individual employees. Most devastatingly, the discretionary income that allowed her to maintain her sophisticated lifestyle, the organic groceries, the book club membership, the weekend wine tastings with Richard's family, would simply evaporate. I'd spent the afternoon reviewing Sarah's credit reports and banking patterns, trying to predict how quickly she'd notice the changes and how she'd react when reality hit. Based on her spending habits, she had about 3 weeks before the financial pressure became undeniable. 3 weeks to figure out that her comfortable life had been built on a foundation she'd never bothered to acknowledge, much less appreciate. The most painful part was knowing that when Sarah finally called me, and she would call me, probably in tears, probably desperate, I'd have to resist every paternal instinct to fix her problems immediately. This lesson only worked if she experienced the full weight of consequences without rescue. She needed to understand that being supported and being independent were two completely different things, and that the father she found embarrassing had been the difference between her comfortable reality and her actual earning capacity all along. Money can't buy respect, but its absence teaches gratitude quickly. 3 weeks and 2 days after Christmas dinner, my phone rang at 11:47 p.m. with a call I'd been both expecting and dreading. Sarah's name appeared on my screen, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, steeling myself for what I knew would be the hardest conversation of our relationship. Her voice was shaky, confused, tinged with the kind of panic that comes from discovering that your understanding of reality was completely wrong.
Dad, something weird is happening with my accounts.
My mortgage payment bounced, my car lease company is saying there's been a contract modification, and my bank is telling me about some trust account that got closed. Do you know anything about this? The innocence in her question was heartbreaking. Even faced with financial chaos, she couldn't conceive that her embarrassing truck driver father might be connected to her sophisticated lifestyle. I'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed my response to sound concerned but uninformed.
That sounds serious, honey.
Have you talked to your bank manager? Maybe there's been some kind of mistake with the paperwork. What followed was 2 weeks of watching my daughter slowly unravel the financial reality she'd never bothered to examine. She'd started by assuming it was all a bureaucratic error. Surely someone at the bank had mixed up account numbers, or her mortgage company had applied someone else's payment to her file. She'd spent hours on hold with customer service representatives, demanding to speak with supervisors, insisting that there had to be some mistake. The first real crack in her composure came when the BMW dealership informed her that her lease had reverted to standard terms because the corporate guarantor had withdrawn from the agreement. The monthly payment had nearly tripled overnight, and when she demanded to know who this mysterious corporate guarantor was, they'd simply said it was a McKenzie Logistics LLC and given her my business phone number. She'd stared at that piece of paper for 2 hours, sitting in the dealership parking lot, before calling me with a voice I hadn't heard since she was 8 years old and had gotten lost at the county fair. Dad, there's a company called McKenzie Logistics that was apparently paying for part of my car. The name, it's the same as ours. Is that? Do you know anything about that? I told her I wasn't sure, that Mackenzie was a common name, and maybe she should look into it further. The suggestion that she investigate her own life was the kindest cruelty I could offer. making her do the detective work that would lead to understanding what she'd taken for granted. The breaking point came when Sarah attempted to pay her first unsubsidized mortgage payment and discovered she was $2,100 short after covering her other expenses. For the first time in her adult life, she had to choose between maintaining her lifestyle and maintaining her obligations. She'd called Richard III in tears, asking if they could, temporarily, combine their finances until she figured out what was going wrong with her accounts. That conversation hadn't gone well. Richard III had been supportive but practical, pointing out that their dual professional income budget was already stretched with his architectural firm's slow season. Adding Sarah's premium lifestyle expenses would mean cutting back on their own discretionary spending, and suddenly the wine tastings and weekend getaways became impossible. The marriage was solid, but it wasn't rich enough to subsidize the standard of living Sarah had assumed was normal for someone in her profession. I'd watched from a distance as my daughter experienced something she'd never encountered before: the gap between what she wanted and what she could afford. The organic groceries were replaced with store brands. The weekly book club meetings became monthly because she couldn't afford the coffee shop locations. The designer clothes shopping stopped entirely, replaced with careful consideration of whether each purchase was truly necessary. Most painfully, she'd had to decline several social invitations with Richard's family because the restaurants they favored were beyond her actual budget. For the first time, Sarah was living like a pediatric nurse instead of like the secretly wealthy daughter of a logistics magnate. The education was working exactly as I'd hoped, but watching her struggle was like performing surgery on my own heart without anesthesia. Every night, I had to resist the overwhelming urge to call my accountant and restore the safety net, to end her confusion and financial stress with a single phone call. But this lesson only worked if she experienced the full weight of independence, if she understood the difference between earning a comfortable life and being given one. She needed to appreciate not just the money I'd provided, but the sacrifice and complexity required to provide it consistently for 30 years without recognition or gratitude. That's when she realized I wasn't the one who needed to prove my worth. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in late January, 6 weeks after her financial world had collapsed. Sarah's voice was different, smaller, broken, stripped of the confident sophistication that had defined her for years. She'd spent the day at the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce researching business licenses, trying to understand the mysterious McKenzie logistics that had apparently been controlling her financial life. What she'd discovered had shattered every assumption she'd ever made about her father and herself. "Dad," she whispered, and I could hear she'd been crying. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth."
"Are you, do you on McKenzie Logistics?"
The question hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. For 30 years, I dreaded and anticipated this moment, when my daughter would finally see behind the curtain I'd carefully maintained. I could have continued the charade, could have deflected with another vague non-answer, but her voice told me she'd already figured out the truth.
"Yes, sweetheart. I do."
The silence that followed was the sound of a worldview collapsing. When she finally spoke, her words came in broken fragments, like someone trying to assemble a puzzle while the pieces kept changing shape. The woman at the Chamber of Commerce said McKenzie Logistics is the largest independent shipping company in the Midwest. She said it employs over 300 people. She said the owner would have to be. Dad, she said whoever runs that company would have to be worth. She couldn't finish the sentence. I finished it for her. About $47 million, according to the last business valuation. The gasp that escaped her was part shock, part grief, part recognition of how completely she'd misunderstood her own life. "But you drive a truck. You wear work clothes. You live in that little house. I thought, all these years I thought you were just a truck driver who didn't understand your sophisticated world?" The words came out gentler than I'd intended, but they still hit their mark. "Sarah, I've been driving trucks because I love driving trucks, not because it was my only option. I've been wearing work clothes because I work with my hands, not because I can't afford better clothes. And I've been living simply because fancy houses don't mean much when you're on the road 200 days a year. What happened next was the sound of 30 years of assumptions crumbling all at once. Sarah began to sob, not the polite tears of adult disappointment, but the raw, ugly crying of a child who discovered that everything she thought she knew was wrong. Between gasps, she started cataloging the magnitude of her misunderstanding.
The BMW, the mortgage, my insurance.
Dad, how long have you been paying for everything? Since you graduated college. 12 years of making sure you never had to worry about money while you figured out your career and your life. But I thought I was independent. I thought I was successful on my own. I've been telling everyone how proud I was to be self-sufficient. Her voice broke completely.
I've been so awful to you.
All those times I corrected your grammar, or asked you to park around the corner, or introduced you as just a truck driver. Oh God, Dad, I told people you didn't understand sophisticated things while I was making sure you could afford to be sophisticated. The revelation was destroying her, and watching it happen was destroying me. But some truths are too big to be learned gently. They have to crash through your consciousness like freight trains, demolishing everything you thought you knew about yourself and forcing you to rebuild from scratch. Richard's father, she whispered, and I knew she was remembering every conversation where she'd praised his wisdom and worldliness. When he talks about business success and financial planning. Dad, you could buy his insurance company with pocket change, couldn't you? Probably. But that's not the point, Sarah. Then what is the point? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think? Why did you let me be so embarrassed of you? This was the hardest question to answer, because the honest answer revealed my own failures as clearly as hers. Because I wanted you to love me for being your father, not for being your financial solution. I wanted our relationship to be real, not transactional. But somewhere along the way, I accidentally taught you that appearances matter more than character, that sophistication is more valuable than sacrifice. I failed you as a parent, and you failed me as a daughter, and we both have to figure out how to fix that. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Sarah asking question after question about the business, about the money, about the man she'd never bothered to really know. Each answer revealed another layer of her misunderstanding, another example of how thoroughly she'd underestimated the father she'd spent years wishing she could replace. By the end of the call, we'd both been emotionally exhausted, but something had fundamentally shifted between us. The daughter who'd wished Richard II was her father was gone, replaced by a woman who was just beginning to understand what it meant to have a father worth respecting. I didn't cut her off to punish her. I did it to save the daughter I raised. Over the following weeks, Sarah began asking questions I'd hoped she'd never need to ask, and I found myself revealing sacrifices I'd never intended to discuss. The hardest part about being a good parent is that your biggest victories are invisible, your greatest successes go unnoticed, and your most profound love is often expressed through what you don't do rather than what you do. Sarah had lived her entire adult life believing she'd achieved her comfortable lifestyle through her own merit, never knowing that every step of her independence had been carefully orchestrated and financially underwritten by a father she'd learned to see as inadequate. The revelation started with small questions about timeline and logistics. Dad, when exactly did you start the company? How did you go from one truck to all of this? What she discovered was that Mackenzie Logistics hadn't grown organically. It had been engineered specifically around her life milestones, expanded strategically to fund her dreams, and structured legally to provide for her future without her knowledge. Every major business decision I'd made for 30 years had been filtered through a single question. Will this help Sarah have the life she deserves? When she was 5 and needed speech therapy for a slight lisp, I'd taken on hazardous material transportation contracts that paid triple rates but required driving through chemical zones that shortened life expectancy. When she was 12 and wanted to attend music camp, I'd bought 2 additional trucks and hired drivers specifically to generate the summer income her enrichment activities required. When she was 16 and dreamed of studying abroad, I bid on a contract to haul machinery to Alaska during winter months, the kind of dangerous, high-paying work that only desperate men accept. Each expansion of the business had been motivated by Sarah's expanding needs and dreams. I'd never told her that my decision to miss her high school graduation was because I was closing the deal that would fund her college education. I'd never explained that my absence from her nursing school pinning ceremony was because I was in Detroit, negotiating the pharmaceutical transport contract that would ensure her post-graduation financial security. I'd never mentioned that during her wedding weekend, while she danced with Richard II and praised his sophistication, I was in my hotel room finalizing the acquisition that would guarantee her newlywed lifestyle. The business success she discovered wasn't the result of entrepreneurial ambition. It was the byproduct of paternal love translated into logistics and leveraged into security. "But Dad," she asked during one of our painful revelation conversations, "what did you want for yourself? What dreams did you give up to build all this?" The question shattered something inside me because it forced me to confront 30 years of choices I'd never framed as sacrifices. I'd wanted to remarry after Mary died, had even met a wonderful woman named Patricia who understood my grief and loved Sarah like her own daughter. But dating required time and emotional availability. I was investing in building Sarah's future instead. Patricia had waited 2 years for me to be ready for a relationship, but I was always planning the next business expansion, always calculating Sarah's next financial need. I'd wanted to travel after Sarah graduated college, had dreamed of seeing Europe and taking the kind of vacations I'd spent decades making possible for other families. But every vacation dollar was redirected into Sarah's emergency fund, her down payment savings, her lifestyle subsidies. I'd wanted to buy a small farm in Vermont and try my hand at something peaceful after 30 years of highway stress. But Vermont would have meant distance from Sarah, and distance meant inability to provide the immediate support she might need. I'd wanted to write a book about logistics management, had even been approached by a publisher who'd heard about McKinsey Logistics' innovative cold storage solutions. But writing required time for reflection, and reflection time was time not spent expanding the business that funded Sarah's world. Every dream I'd deferred, every opportunity I'd declined, every relationship I'd avoided had been motivated by a single driving principle. My daughter would never experience the limitations that had defined my own childhood. She would never have to choose between her dreams and her budget, never have to apologize for wanting something better, never have to sacrifice her aspirations to practical concerns. What I'd failed to consider was that in protecting her from struggle, I'd accidentally prevented her from developing appreciation.
In making everything easy, id made nothing valuable.
In removing all obstacles, I'd removed all opportunities for her to understand what obstacles looked like and what it cost someone else to remove them. The financial cutoff hadn't been punishment, it had been surgery. Sometimes you have to let someone experience pain to save them from something worse than pain. A life without understanding, gratitude, or genuine connection to the people who love them most. Respect is rebuilt one honest conversation at a time, not with grand gestures. The healing process between Sarah and me wasn't a Hollywood montage of tearful reunions and instant understanding. It was months of awkward conversations, tentative steps forward, and the slow, careful work of two people learning to see each other clearly for the first time. Sarah's first attempt at making amends was exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd grown up believing that problems could be solved with the right purchase or gesture. She'd shown up at my house with an expensive bottle of scotch and a speech she'd clearly rehearsed about misunderstanding our relationship. I'd listened politely, accepted the scotch graciously, and then told her that apologies, like respect, couldn't be bought. They had to be earned through changed behavior over time. The real work began when Sarah asked if she could spend a Saturday riding along on one of my delivery runs. Not as a symbolic gesture, but because she genuinely wanted to understand what I'd been doing for 30 years while she'd been dismissing it as just trucking. That first ride was uncomfortable for both of us. She kept trying to make conversation about business strategy and profit margins, clearly struggling to reconcile the sophisticated logistics operation she discovered with the simple truck cab environment she was experiencing. I finally had to tell her to stop trying so hard and just observe. "Sarah," I said as we pulled into a distribution center in Davenport, You spent 30 years not seeing me. Don't compound the mistake by trying to see too much too fast. The breakthrough came during our third monthly dinner together, a new tradition we'd established to rebuild our connection without the pressure of holidays or special occasions. Sarah had been telling me about a difficult case at the hospital, a 7-year-old with leukemia whose parents were struggling with medical bills and transportation to treatments. Without thinking, she'd asked if Mackenzie Logistics might be able to help with medical transport logistics, then stopped mid-sentence as she realized what she'd just done.
I'm sorry, Dad.
I didn't mean to assume you'd want to use your business to help a sick child? Sarah, that's exactly what the business is for. That's what it's always been for. That was the moment she understood that my work had never been about accumulating wealth. It had been about using capability to solve problems for people who needed solutions. The hardest conversation came when Sarah asked about her childhood, specifically about the choices I'd made that had kept me away from school events and family milestones. She'd assumed my absences were due to financial necessity, but now that she understood the business success, she couldn't figure out why I'd continued missing important moments even after Mackenzie Logistics was profitable enough to hire other drivers. Dad, you could have afforded to stay home after I turned 10. Why didn't you? The honest answer was that I'd been afraid that if I stopped being essential to the business operations, I might become irrelevant to Sarah's security. I'd confused being needed financially with being needed emotionally, and by the time I'd realized the difference, the pattern was too established to change without risking the empire I'd built for her protection. I was afraid that if I wasn't actively working to provide for your future, someone else might not work as hard to protect it.
I trusted mai on dedication more than I trusted any on LCS.
Sarah had cried when I'd admitted that, but they were different tears than the shocked sobs of discovery. These were tears of understanding, recognition that we'd both made mistakes that had cost us decades of authentic connection. The rebuilding process required Sarah to examine not just her assumptions about me, but her assumptions about herself. She'd had to confront the uncomfortable reality that her adult accomplishments were less independent than she'd believed, her sophistication less earned than she'd assumed. But rather than diminishing her sense of self, the truth had actually strengthened her character by giving her a more accurate foundation to build upon. She'd also had to learn new ways of interacting with Richard's family, particularly Richard II. Where once she'd sought his approval and validation, she now engaged with him as someone who understood that wisdom comes from experience, not just from education or inherited advantage. The change was subtle but significant. She was no longer trying to prove she belonged in his world, because she discovered she already belonged in a world of her own. 6 months after our reconnection began, Sarah made a decision that surprised us both. She used her nursing expertise to develop a medical transport consultation service for Mackenzie Logistics, creating a bridge between our worlds that honored both her professional skills and her newfound understanding of the family business. It wasn't about joining the company. It was about contributing to something larger than herself while maintaining her own identity and career. Respect, I'd learned, isn't something you demand or deserve. It's something you cultivate through consistent authenticity over time. Christmas isn't about the gifts we give, but the sacrifice behind them that goes unseen. 1 year later, as I sit in Sarah's living room watching her wrap presents for her first Christmas as a truly independent adult, I'm struck by how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. The house is smaller now. She'd downsized to something her nursing salary could actually afford. But it feels warmer, more honest, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from understanding rather than entitlement. The Christmas tree is smaller too, decorated with ornaments that tell stories rather than showcase expense, and somehow it's more beautiful than any of the perfect displays from her previous life. Sarah moves differently now, with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where her blessings come from and what they cost. She'd insisted on paying for tonight's dinner herself, not because she had to prove her independence, but because she wanted to demonstrate her gratitude through action rather than words. The meal was simpler than the elaborate spreads Richard II used to orchestrate, but every dish was prepared with intention and appreciation. When she'd asked me to say grace, I'd almost cried. Not because of the words I spoke, but because of the daughter who'd thought to ask. The most profound change isn't in Sarah's financial circumstances or living situation. It's in her relationships. She still loves Richard III deeply, but their marriage is now built on realistic expectations rather than subsidized fantasies. They work together to maintain a lifestyle they can actually afford, making decisions as partners rather than as beneficiaries of invisible support. Richard II is still part of their lives, but Sarah no longer seeks his approval or validation. She engages with him as an equal, someone who appreciates his perspective without needing him to define her worth or sophistication. The hardest lesson for both of us was learning that love and respect aren't the same thing, even though they should coexist in healthy families. I'd loved Sarah unconditionally for 38 years, but I'd accidentally taught her that respect was optional as long as love was present. She'd loved me in return, but had learned to express that love through polite tolerance rather than genuine appreciation. The financial crisis had forced us both to confront the difference between loving someone and actually seeing them clearly enough to respect what they've sacrificed for your benefit. Tonight, Sarah had given me a gift that no amount of money could purchase. A handwritten letter detailing everything she'd learned about sacrifice, gratitude, and the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. She'd written about her new understanding of strength, not as the ability to appear sophisticated or independent, but as the willingness to acknowledge dependence when it exists and to honor the people who make your dreams possible. The letter was her way of saying thank you for 30 years of sacrifices she'd never noticed and apologies for 30 years of respect she'd never offered. The most beautiful part of our new relationship is that it's built on truth rather than performance. Sarah knows exactly who I am, the truck-driving millionaire who chose simple living over impressive appearances, who built an empire to fund her dreams while teaching her to value character over credentials. I know exactly who she is, the pediatric nurse who inherited her mother's compassion and her father's work ethic, who needed to experience struggle to appreciate security, who confused privilege with personal achievement until reality taught her the difference. As I watch her now, carefully budgeting wrapping paper and choosing practical gifts that demonstrate thoughtfulness rather than expense, I'm proud of the woman she's become, not because she's successful or sophisticated, but because she's grateful and genuine. The daughter who once wished another man was her father has become a woman who understands that fatherhood isn't about charm or cultural knowledge. It's about showing up consistently, sacrificing willingly, and loving unconditionally even when that love isn't immediately recognized or appreciated. The lesson of that devastating Christmas dinner wasn't just about gratitude or respect. It was about the courage required to love someone enough to let them experience consequences, to care more about their character development than their immediate comfort, to risk temporary anger for the sake of long-term understanding. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give a child is the opportunity to discover what they're capable of when the safety net disappears and they have to rely on their own strength and values. If this story made you think about your own family, tell me in the comments. What sacrifice did your parents make that you only appreciated years later? And parents, what do you wish your children understood about what you've given up for them? Let's restore gratitude in our families, because Christmas isn't about the gifts we give, but the sacrifice behind them that goes unseen. Don't forget to subscribe. This old trucker has more stories about the price of ingratitude and the power of tough love.